Pēteris Kļava, a doctor with more than 20 years of experience as an intensivist, often witnessed the phenomenon of death. He used all available technologies to bring patients back to life, but sometimes encountered something incomprehensible. Some clinical cases could not be scientifically explained, at least not at that time. These events prompted him to seek answers to questions that went beyond traditional medicine. For example, does our life have an end? Is there another world? Does the human being have an immortal soul? Over time, Pēteris Kļava concluded that he had succeeded in finding answers to these questions. He shared his experiences and noted that throughout his work, he had witnessed hundreds of deaths. He observed that people who had lost their loved ones rarely asked the question of what death truly is. In moments of loss, they only think about never seeing their loved one again, experiencing deep sorrow, and grieving for years. But when one of them does contemplate the nature of death, the pain begins to subside, as the realization comes that death, as such, does not exist. The impulse for a deeper investigation into this topic came from an unusual case that resembled the plot of a science fiction film more than real medical practice. This event changed his view of the boundary between life and death and made him doubt the traditional scientific views on human existence. Pēteris Kļava understood that death is not simply the end of the biological functions of the body, but something much more complex, involving consciousness, perception, and possibly a transition into another state of being. Since then, the search for the truth and the engagement with this topic became an indispensable part of his professional activity. The doctor began studying the works of scientists, philosophers, and doctors who dealt with questions of near-death experiences. He spoke with patients who had survived clinical death and analyzed their reports. With each new case, it became clearer to him that traditional medical explanations were insufficient to fully understand this mysterious phenomenon. One of the mystical cases he recounted was the story of a boy who experienced a terrible tragedy. A severe fire broke out in his house. His mother died, and he himself suffered severe burns that were incompatible with life. The doctors realized that the chances of saving him were almost zero, but they still did everything to alleviate his suffering. As Pēteris Kļava made his way to the room, he felt that medicine was powerless in this case. On the way, he noticed a strange detail. A nurse went into the room. This moment did not seem unusual to him at the time, but later, this incident stayed in his memory for a long time. Pēteris Kļava remembered that there was something unusual about the appearance of the mysterious nurse. Her long, loose hair and the excessively large gown, which seemed more like atypical clothing for a hospital, immediately caught his attention. He entered the room just a few seconds after he had seen her go in, but the nurse was already gone. The doctor searched the room. There were no traces of her presence, as if she had vanished into thin air. At the same time, the medical equipment showed a sudden decline in the boy's condition. Knowing that there was no more time left, Pēteris Kļava immediately began resuscitation, but all his efforts were in vain. The child died. This case stayed in the doctor's memory for a long time. He repeatedly went over what had happened, trying to find a logical explanation. Who could that mysterious woman in the long gown have been? How could she have disappeared so suddenly? Over time, as he thought about it, Kļava concluded that the unknown woman was none other than the boy's mother. Perhaps her soul had returned to accompany her son on his final journey, to help him leave this world and transition into another. The doctor is convinced that death is not an end, but merely a transition into another form of existence. Sometimes, those who loved us in life return so that we do not have to walk that path alone. But this was not the only case in which Pēteris Kļava encountered something incomprehensible. Another story concerns a boy who suffered from a severe form of pneumonia. The doctor recounted this case. This patient spent more than 6 weeks in the hospital. One day, when I started my shift, his vital signs began to deteriorate rapidly. I took all possible measures, but it was clear that his condition was critical. The boy's parents were in the hospital, and I informed them that I could only temporarily stabilize their son's condition, but I could not save him. At that moment, The boy's father fell to his knees before me. Tears ran down his face, and he pleaded, "Do everything you can. Now God is working through your hands. If he wants, my son will live. If you stop, God will have no hands left." Such behavior did not astonish me. In moments like these, pain clouds the mind, and a person is ready to do anything. To give the father hope and buy him time to compose himself, I continued to support the boy, even though I knew there was no chance left. I thought just one more minute and it would be over. But minute by minute, the patient kept breathing, and suddenly his condition began to improve. He survived the night and then another. After a few days, the boy was transferred to a regular ward. He was healed. The doctor himself admitted, "This cannot be explained from the perspective of academic science by any scientist in the world." Pēteris Kļava admitted that, of course, one could make various assumptions and hypotheses, but he did not have a scientific explanation for many of the cases. However, when analyzing such events, he often caught himself thinking that someone with greater knowledge was intentionally intervening in the happenings, as if to say, "You thought life here ends, but look, it continues." Regarding such mystical episodes in his practice, the doctor said, "There are moments in life that cannot be erased from memory, but it is difficult to talk about them." Most of the time, such people encounter doctors or astronauts. These people mostly remain silent about it because they fear being considered crazy or losing their job. Still, there were many such cases in Pēteris Kļava's practice. For example, he remembered the story of a boy whom everyone thought was a hopeless patient, but he not only came back to life, but also told about his unusual experiences. A boy came to us in a comatose state. He was connected to a ventilator. The patient's condition was so severe that the chances of saving him were minimal. For days passed. I was on the night shift when I heard strange sounds coming from the boy's room. When I went in, I saw that he had regained consciousness, and the equipment showed a drastic improvement in his vital functions. Later, I asked the boy what he remembered. His story surprised me. He said that at first he observed everything happening in the hospital, the nurses, the doctors, other rooms, and then he went on a journey to different planets. Pēteris Kļava might not have believed this story if the boy had not been able to name the doctors who had been with him during the coma. This case interested the doctor so much that he began collecting similar stories, not only from his patients but also from other people. One day, a woman from Germala called him, completely confused. The woman wanted the doctor's opinion on a strange incident that had happened to her that morning. She told me that she woke up and went to the kitchen to get some water. She reached out her right hand for a cup, but could not grab it. Her hand seemed to pass through the object. The woman thought she had laid down her arm, so it was numb, and she decided it was just an illusion. But the attempt to grab the cup with her left hand also failed. Then she tried to grab the teapot, but her hand seemed to simply sink into it. Startled, she went back to the bedroom, hoping to sleep and forget what she had experienced. Then she saw herself sleeping next to her husband. In a panic, my acquaintance jumped back in her body. It happened so suddenly that her husband woke up. Now, she called me and asked, "Am I going crazy?" Throughout his long medical career, Pēteris Kļava collected many stories in which something incomprehensible occurred. While observing patients who had had near-death experiences, he noticed that such people became internally freer and shed their fears. They stopped worrying about trivial things. They began to take joy in simple things: a blooming flower, a warm cup of tea. People who had returned from the other side no longer expected anything from others and viewed life's difficulties differently. According to Kļava, someone who has left their body and returned understands how fragile and imperfect this world is. Such a person realizes that death is not the end of the road, but merely a transition to another state, and therefore loses the fear of it. These reflections by Pēteris Kļava on the nature of death and the transition of the soul into another world were shaped not only by his medical practice, but also by profound observations of patients who had near-death experiences. He sought answers to questions about the boundary between life and death and what happens to the human consciousness after physical death. A particularly strong impression was left by the story of the girl who died during an operation. The crying that could be heard from the empty room could not be explained by the doctors or nurses. Even those who knew nothing about her death heard a child's voice calling for her mother. Pēteris Kļava thought about this case for a long time and concluded that the girl's soul could not cross into the other world due to the intense pain of her mother. According to the doctor, screams and tears can hold the soul at the boundary between worlds, preventing its transition. This led him to consider that death is not a sharp break, but a gradual process that requires special conditions. To cross into the new reality, the soul needs peace, support, and a gentle environment. Creating a warm and peaceful atmosphere around the dying helps the soul to travel this path harmoniously. The doctor compared death to birth. Just as the future child needs attention and care before birth, so too does the soul preparing to leave the body need special support. The soul is like a seed that must sprout in a new space, and it needs peace and gentle sorrow, said Kļava. He explained to the relatives of the patients that they should not be afraid, but instead help the soul to free itself, without binding it to the earthly world through their own suffering. The doctor tried to convey to the relatives of the dying the simple but important idea: death is not the end, but a transition to another form of being, to another reality, where the soul continues its journey. These ideas also find confirmation in the quantum consciousness theory, according to which the soul is an informational entity that exists on the quantum level. After the death of the physical body, this information does not disappear but merges with the universe and remains eternal within it. Such an understanding helps to reduce the fear of death, removes worries, and allows one to appreciate every moment of life. Pēteris Kļava shared the example of a girl who comforted her parents while dying. She said, "Do not be afraid, but we are not here. We exist in the Spirit of God." These words echoed the thoughts of Albert Einstein, who believed that our perception of time is just an illusion, and that the past, present, and future exist simultaneously in a higher reality. The doctor emphasized that one can perceive death not as a tragedy, but as a transition, which makes life more conscious and fulfilling. He advised not to fixate on the material, to enjoy simple things, and to accept every life situation with an understanding of its temporal nature. These reflections help many patients and their families to view life and death from a new perspective and to accept them as natural parts of a unified existence process. If you enjoyed this text and want to see more similar content, don't forget to give it a like, share your opinion in the comments, and subscribe to us. Your support is important to us.